movies, TV shows based on movies, toys based on movies, games based on movies, and surroundings based on movies. I'm your host, Mr. CCS, and these are my pets, George the Gorilla, Call the Dolphin, and Frank the Sea Turtle. Okay, as we continue our way through the mid to late 90s, we find that far more video games will get the live-action movie treatment. Despite the fact that Mario was a huge flop at the box office, there were still more movies based on the experiences one could have at home on their favorite consoles. In late 1994, there were not one, but two movies that were of the martial arts genre, and both of which were based on popular beat-em-up games. We're going to focus on the first of these today, which is based on the video game series simply known as Double Dragon. So, you might be wondering what Double Dragon is, and I'm going to tell you. Double Dragon was one of the first successful beat-em-up video games. What was the premise? Twin brothers Billy and Jimmy Lee are martial arts experts, and they are pit up against all odds on the streets in order to save Billy's girlfriend Marion from the wicked Black Warriors gang. The game was a huge hit in the arcades and on home consoles, resulting in multiple sequels and spin-offs. Due to the popularity of the franchise, it would only make sense for the games to be brought to the big screen, akin to classic martial arts films starring Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris. The movie eventually made its way to theaters in November of 1994, and was an enormous flop. Though critics praised the action sequences and special effects, they criticized the script and writing the film had to offer. However, 30 years later, is this movie really a diamond in the rough? Well, let's find out today. This is the 1994 film adaptation of Double Dragon. In post-apocalyptic California, like we haven't seen that before, brothers Billy and Jimmy Lee, played by Scott Wolf and Mark Dacascos, are highly trained martial artists living in the ravaged city of New Angeles. This is giving me serious Futurama vibes. The pair have been trained by Satori, played by Julia Nixon, who took them in after their parents died. When Satori finds herself pursued by an evil overlord named Koga Shuko, played by Robert Patrick, who's intent on possessing her mystical dragon medallion, the siblings are charged with protecting it from Shuko and his henchmen. Okay, so I'm not admittedly the biggest fan of Double Dragon. As a matter of fact, I haven't played any of the games, nor am I super familiar with the story. However, I really enjoy the simple concept of it. Two brothers that fight through the scum of the streets to save a girl. It's a very simple street-level story that would have made for an excellent movie. However, this film takes it upon itself to do something completely different and decided to make it a martial arts story with a distinct dystopian tone, and it sort of works in some ways, but it is detrimental in others. I think if the story was less focused on being dystopian and more focused on the game's plotline, I think I would have liked it a bit more. I understand that the film had to invent stuff, but keeping the necklace element as the only new thing would have made far more sense. Now, that said, the movie may not have had a good story, but it definitely makes up for it with its over-the-top tone. This movie is extremely fun, and that's the tone it mostly sticks with, and it works for the better. It's far from a good movie per se, but my god, it's just so extremely entertaining. And I wouldn't mind having it on in the background every so often. However, before anything else, I would like to make it clear that I will not be referring to this movie as an adaptation anymore, nor will I talk about the references aside from the obvious ones, because I'm not a fan of the Double Dragon series. I'll simply approach this as a normal review. Alright, with that said, here we go. So, right off the bat, the Lee brothers were pretty decent. I like their relationship and how they eventually realize that they are all they have for each other. But I'm also thinking that since the movie is more style over substance, they weren't given nearly enough screen time. If it were me, I'd make the main focus be on the brothers and have it stick with the plotline from the games, where they go out and try to rescue and equally woo Marion, but that's not what happened. I think Scott Wolf and Mark Dacascos did a good job with what they were given, but they were far from great, and if you watch the movie, you can really feel that. Moving on to Marion, they tried to give her more to do, which I thought was kinda neat, but she's super forgettable most of the time, and that's evident in several scenes, where they carelessly throw her back into the plot. Alyssa Milano doesn't do a bad job with what she's given, much like Wolf and Dacascos, but she's still not good, and one of the many reminders of how many great actors are wasted in these roles. The character looking after the Lee brothers, Satori, was only in the movie for a very short time, and the impact of her death doesn't really make me feel anything, and that's because we spend hardly any time with her, and we don't truly get to see the connection she has with the brothers, hence why I really had a hard time feeling for her. Enough said. Then there's Abobo and Linda, two of the more memorable enemies in the games. Abobo started off pretty decent, and then they turned him into this ugly mutant monster that they try to make you feel for, and it doesn't work in the slightest, because this character is supposed to be ruthless and an angry brute, not someone this sympathetic. Linda was just the crappy henchwoman of the villain, and I have nothing much to say about her. Speaking of the villain, we have Koga Shuko, the whitest Japanese character I've ever seen. Okay, he's only using a Japanese name, but I feel like Robert Patrick was completely miscast in this role. On the one hand, I really like his shadow ability, because it made the character just a bit more threatening, but on the other hand, he's still extremely generic, and I don't think I'll remember him in a few weeks from reviewing this film. After that, I ran out of characters to talk about. I mean, there's the chief of police. I've got nothing. I really have nothing. Let's move on to the effects. So, mostly the practical effects are pretty good. I really like the look and feel of New Angeles. It's not the most dynamic dystopian world, but it does have a very good look for the time. All the cars have the distinct otherworldly flair to them, and the prosthetics used to make Abobo that weird monster are pretty great. The CGI used to turn Shuko into the shadow creature looks extremely dated, and that bothers me for that very reason, seeing as how there were movies beforehand that looked better than this one that came out years earlier. That's all I really had to say about the visual effects and the effects overall. Moving on. As far as the music goes, it was composed by Toka Caddis and Jay Ferguson. It's got a distinct 90s flair to it, but at the same time, it's far from the most memorable thing I've heard, which sucks, because it had so much potential. Now, finally, we have the action. While I can clearly see the effort put into several of these action scenes, as they are all, at the very least, well choreographed, they show their age in several moments, and they're very uninteresting. They are the weakest fight scenes I've ever seen, pretty much, and they're very sluggish, and you know what? I'm done. Double Dragon is a bad movie, but that doesn't make it enjoyably bad. The goofy tone and the actors having a blast is what saves it from the terrible script completely hurting it, but that's about all the nice things I have to say. It had so much potential, but ultimately, it's just not very good, which is why I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10. Not the worst thing in the world, but far from something that I'll have to want to watch often. And you know what? I feel like that's going to be a lot of reviews this season. I'm just going to, ramble on for a few minutes and then just kind of give up halfway through. Sorry, guys. This really is just going to be the longest season I've done so far. Okay, well, that was something to talk about for sure. Feel free to leave your thoughts on this movie below, and if you've seen it, of course. And tune in next week for the review of the second martial arts film, which is also a video game adaptation, to which the source material is something I am much more familiar with. Until then, and with that said, my name is Mr. CCS, this is Movie Central, and that, my friends, is a wrap. See you next week.